The gospel lesson for today is a familiar parable of Jesus about a wedding feast. Usually, when this particular parable is read, it's read from the gospel according to St. Luke. So that's what sounds familiar in our ears. But on this particular Sunday, the lectionary assigns us Matthew's understanding of the same parable, and it reads a bit differently. Listen for the word of God. Once more, Jesus spoke to them in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding banquet for his son. He sent his servants to call those who had been invited to the wedding banquet, but they would not come. Again, he sent other servants, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, look, I prepared the dinner. My oxen and my fat calves have been slaughtered. Everything is ready. Come to the wedding banquet.' But they made light of it and went away, one to his farm, another to his business, while the rest seized the servants, mistreated them, and killed them. The king was enraged. He sent his troops, destroyed those murderers, and burned their city. And then he said to his servants, 'The wedding's ready, but those invited were not worthy. So go, therefore, into the main streets and invite everyone you find to the wedding banquet.' And those servants went out into the streets and gathered all whom they found, both good and bad, so that the wedding hall was filled with guests. But when the king came in to see the guests, he noticed a man there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?' And he was speechless. And the king said to the attendants, 'Bind him hand and foot, throw him into the outer darkness where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen.'" Here's the truth. I wish St. Matthew had left the last paragraph off that parable. Those final 4 verses are so very harsh, so damningly judgmental, so seemingly unfair. They stand in such contrast to the extraordinary invitation, the extravagant welcome, the abundant generosity with which the story began, that they leave us not so much inspired to emulate God's hospitality as to question God's very nature. Luke, at least, has sense enough to omit those 4 verses from his gospel. He also edits out that earlier line about the king becoming so angry that he burned down the city. Instead, what Luke does is expand the section regarding the reason people gave for not coming to the wedding. It's not simply as it is in Matthew, they went off to their farm and another to his business. That is to say, people chose to skip the festivities because, well, they were just too busy with their daily routines. Rather, according to St. Luke, the first was in the process of completing an important real estate deal, not something you and I do every day. And the second had just bought a big team of oxen and needed to go check that out. And the third, the third was on his honeymoon. Now, if you were on your honeymoon, would you take time to go to a wedding? Of course not. I mean, we read Luke's version and we can understand the reaction. And such editorial changes by St. Luke makes his version of the parable a whole lot easier to preach and more readily acceptable in the pews. Nevertheless, today we're asked to look at Matthew's telling of the story, which, frankly, hits much, much closer to home than does Luke's version. For what makes folks like us miss God's party more often than not is not that we have something critically important to attend to, but rather that we choose to do something else, preoccupied as we are with managing what really are the more mundane responsibilities of just living day by day in this world. The realm of God, said Jesus, is like a king who wanted to give a wedding feast for his child. Let me ask you, anyone here ever spring for a rehearsal dinner or pick up the tab for the meal at the reception of one of your kids when they got married? Yeah, a lot of you have done that. So you know what goes into planning a wedding feast. I mean, you have to work out every detail. You have to put together who's going to be invited and who's going to sit at which table and who's going to offer the toast and who's going to dance with whom and in what order. And menus have to be selected and tuxes have to be ordered and gowns have to be fitted and bands have to be hired. And even the napkins, you got to have that detail about the name of the bride and groom inscribed on them. And then there's the cake. How big a cake are we going to get and what flavor of cake? And you know, this baker does better with the icing than this baker does. And will the groom's cake be like, you know what I'm talking about? Lots and lots of details. Usually the last to be checked out is, does the preacher happen to be free that day? Wedding feasts have become such big deals in our culture that a whole new vocation has been given birth: the professional wedding planner. And according to the March issue of Money magazine, March 2014, the average cost of a wedding in America this year hit the $30,000 mark. That's average. Now, granted, more than half of wedding celebrations cost $10,000 or less, but still, wedding receptions, the wedding festivities are expensive. And the driving factor in the costs is neither the church rental fee nor the pastor's honorarium. The driving factor is the reception. It's the banquet. We invest as much in the wedding feast afterwards as we do in buying a car. Almost everything we need for a down payment on a house. We spend it on a party. And once having gone to all that planning, having invested so much of our time and ourselves and our resources into getting ready for that big banquet, we expect those on the attendance list, the invitation list, to come, don't we? And when we notice somebody didn't come, we wonder why, and we ask why, and we're beyond hurt when the reasons they give don't seem nearly as important to us as our child getting married. So we can understand why the king would get angry. That's the easy part of this parable. The hard part is what the king does next. He orders his servants to go out to the main streets. Right, you're a block off downtown. He invites them to go downtown, and he wants them to invite to the wedding to bring back as many people as they can find. That is to say, they're to invite to the party people who previously were not on the invitation list. People who were not part of either the inner circle of friends and family or the extended circle of acquaintances and associates. They were to invite people whom they didn't know or would have preferred not to notice. And Luke gets it, at least in part. That's why when he retells the story, he expands that detail a bit, and he says the servants weren't just sent out to the main street, they also were to go into the back alleys. And in Luke's version of it, they're sent out not once, but they're sent out twice to make sure that everybody is included. And, says Luke, they are not simply to invite, they are to compel. They are to make sure that they bring into the wedding hall the poor and the maimed and the blind and the lame. That's what Luke says. The poor and the maimed, the blind and the lame. And when we hear that line in Luke's telling of it, we say, yeah, that's a Christian thing to do. I mean, as Christians, we're supposed to be compassionate with respect to those who are in need. And we're supposed to reach out and embrace those who are hurt. Christ did that. We should do that. That's part and parcel of who we are. So let's invite to the wedding feast people who are poor and maimed and blind and lame. Oh, but Matthew, he takes it one step further. In Matthew's telling of the parable, the king orders the servant to gather all whom they found, both good and bad. Let me repeat that. All who they found, both good and bad. Now, it's that little detail about both good and bad that takes us far beyond acting on the basis of empathy or need. Now we're talking about including folks we don't even like. Folks who do things we would never do. Folks who are the objects of our prejudices and preconceived notions and hatreds and bigotry. Folks whom we would never, ever invite to come into our homes. Folks whom we would intentionally exclude from our table, thinking that we're really doing the right thing by not inviting bad people like them. Any of you ever been the object of such exclusion? If not, that's why it's hard to hear Matthew's story. If so, you know how it felt. Jack and Annabelle lived 2 apartments down and 1 flight up when Meg and I were in seminary. Jack had served 2 tours in Vietnam, and based on that experience had decided to come to seminary and become an Army chaplain career. Jack and Annabelle and Meg and I, for the 3 years we were in Princeton at school, were best friends. They were the kind of friends with whom you ate Thanksgiving dinner because your own families were hundreds, if not thousands of miles away and you couldn't get home. They were the kind of friends with whom you went for long walks when you needed someone to listen, just listen while you figured out what you needed to do. They were the kind of friends with whom you felt free to drop in unannounced, and it was okay. They were the kind of friends for whom you babysat free of charge. Here's how good of friends they were. They were such good friends that I didn't even care when one of their 2 girls brought over a giant goldfish named Big John to add to my aquarium of tropical fish. Well, one day, our 2 families decided we needed to get away from grad school for a while and take an outing. So we headed to Hershey, Pennsylvania, where there was a big amusement park and more chocolate than anyone can consume. And we had a wonderful time. We rode up and down on the roller coasters and round on the tilt-a-whirl, and we went in and out of the various sections of the chocolate factory in a mechanical cocoa bean. And the smell of chocolate, the smell of chocolate permeated the entire place. Well, as the sun set, we headed back to our seminary apartments and thinking we should break up the long trip by sitting down at a good restaurant to eat rather than going to a junk food restaurant after all the junk food in the amusement park. Jack and I, we headed into this restaurant to get a table while Annabelle and Meg got the kids out of the van. We'll need a table for 6, we told the maitre d'. Of course, he said, motioning to a waiter to prepare a table. It was so late that the supper rush was long over, and the restaurant at that point was less than a quarter full. The waiter got busy preparing a table for 6 that he had been instructed. And Jack and I, well, we just shared small talk with the maitre d' while we were waiting. And in a few minutes, our wives walked through the front door of the restaurant with 2 young children in tow. Seeing those 2 children, immediately, the maitre d' pulled a book out from underneath his desk, and he opened it up, and he made a point of running his finger down the list, and then he turned to Jack and I and said, "Oh, I'm sorry, we won't be able to seat you. You don't have a reservation." That was 40 years ago. And I still remember what it felt like to be excluded from the table. And I realized that that was one incident in my life, and that the pain and the hurt and the anger that welled up within me in that moment has to be as nothing compared to the corporate hurt and pain and anger that has been rising up and is raging within whole populations within American society because of the way in which we segregate and exclude. I'm talking about the effect of racism in America, which continues to rear its ugly head, so that we disproportionately incarcerate young black males, and we systematically underfund urban schools in predominantly African American neighborhoods. And now we're rolling back the clock on voting rights, disenfranchising those living in color who are people of in poverty, who are people of color, reimposing upon them in some states something akin to the old poll tax. And I must say to you, the reaction we saw in Ferguson to the militarized police force should not have come as a surprise to anyone. I'm talking about the effect of the xenophobia in our culture, which would waste millions of dollars on building worthless fences along our southern border. That xenophobia that would rip families apart who have been in this country for decades and deport some of them back while others can stay. That looks upon children fleeing for their lives, riding on top of rolling trains just to get here. And we would meet them at the border and send them back to their possible, if not probable, deaths. That would deny Hispanics crossing the border such basic human necessities as safety and health care and even a drink of water in the desert. I'm talking about the effect of the continued stereotypical depiction of Muslims as terrorists that's on our airwaves day after day after day. And I'm talking about the unexamined assumption that those who are on welfare are takers, basically too lazy to find a job. And I'm talking about the persecution which has driven gay and lesbian persons into closets for generations, and for whom even now, right here in Wisconsin, it's required court action to ensure them their equal protection under the 14th Amendment with respect to the right to marry. And the list goes on and on of group after group after group that we would make feel excluded, unwelcomed. The terrible thing not to be welcomed at a table. It's hard to forget when it happens to you, particularly as blatantly as it did to me that day because of that discrimination against our children. And for those of us in the church, we come to a communion table. Well, there's a need for us to confess our natural inclination to exclude, to gravitate only towards people who look like us and think like us and believe like us, to make the gathering of Christians on Sunday morning, even to this day, still the most segregated hour in America. Now, I'm glad that in recent years, the United Church of Christ very, very intentionally has named that sin aloud in our culture and in our congregations. And we've begun working on being a denomination where, well, you know the phrase, no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you're welcomed here. But I need to say, taking an out of ad with that slogan, or hanging up a God is still speaking banner, or even writing on the bulletin board outside, all are welcomed here. It doesn't do anything to grow congregations. It doesn't do anything to fill the pews with the rich diversity of God's beloved children. 80% of those under the age of 20 in our country have never been inside the walls of a sanctuary. And think about that. 4 out of 5. Never been to church, never been to Sunday school, never been to a funeral except at a funeral home. Never been to a wedding. 4 out of 5 out there on the streets. And if they're not there, their parents aren't either. And when I go and talk with them, they can tell me what it is about the church that makes them feel unwelcomed. And even those who have tried often have left because, having tried, their preconceived notions about how the church is so homogeneous that there's no room in that cell for them. What it takes, what this parable calls us to do, is to actually go out onto the main streets and go out into the back alleys and to gather in not only the poor and maimed and blind and lame, as St. Luke would have us do, but also muster the courage to actually invite others to come to the wedding feast with us. Assuming that any no we receive is to be interpreted as not yet, so that we invite again and again and again. Let me try an experiment. I'm going to ask you to raise your hands if you can answer yes to any of these questions, okay? You're all willing. How many of you, if you saw a great movie, would go tell a friend about it? Not everybody. How many of you, if you read a good book, would be willing to loan it to a neighbor? Good. How many of you, if you had guests to dinner at your home, and you made the family recipe that's been passed down from generation to generation to generation, you know, the one that when you bring it to a potluck here, it disappears right away? How many of you, if you were giving a party at home and a guest who you didn't really know all that well said to you, "That was the best meal I've ever had. I wonder, would you mind sharing with me the secret family recipe for that dish?" How many of you would joyfully give them the recipe? Oh, not as many as before, but the good news is more than at Mineral Point. One last question. How many of you invited someone to come to church this morning with you? Yeah. Sisters and brothers, you know that Christ has invited you to the party, to this table of grace, to this joyful feast of the people of God. I implore you, let the communion table also serve as a constant reminder that God not only calls you to the table, God also sends you out to invite others to the table. Everyone you find, whether they're good or whether they're bad. Okay, I know you're still wondering about those last verses of the parable, the judgmental ones, and how they should be interpreted. Why did the king kick that one person out for no reason other than that he wore the wrong clothes? I have 3 degrees in religion. I've been a minister for 40 years. I haven't a clue. And that's okay. Yeah. When you get to that last section, it should serve as a reminder that when it comes to judging other people, that's God's job. That's not our job. Our job is to invite, and to invite, and to invite until, well, this banquet hall is full.